what Ketuvim are b'chlal, before we can talk about what the place of specifically Nechemia is in Ketuvim, because will make it a bit easier for us. If we view Tanakh as a three-pronged process, and that there's a specific meaning to Torah, Nevi'im, or Ketuvim in terms of the development of the very things that Torah introduces us to initially. And that is ultimately the way in which Ma'aseh Bereshis becomes embedded in the development of creation and the achievement of Malchus and the achievement of all of the ingredients for Mashiach and an understanding of what it is that was done in order to make all that possible. So then we can understand that we first have the laying down, so to speak, of all of the Ritzonot of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the vision, so that our primer and our paradigms are all set down in Torah. That's the first part of Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim, which itself has obviously the differences between the first four Sfarim and the last Sefer, which is the Divrei Moshe, which is very specifically paradigm-oriented, as opposed to the first four, which give us background. And then obviously this way the Rishonim break up those four themselves in each parsha, but talking the broadest possible terms. When we get to Nevi'im, we basically have the description of the way in which the relationship to Eretz Yisrael, until its breakdown, actually gives us the input into the Bria that starts from scratch almost in terms of the actual application, and not surprisingly, in the same way that Torah begins with Koyach Ma'asav Higid Li'ameh, so too does Nevi'im begin with the Latet La Nachalat Goyim, mamish with the first actual crossing over of the Yarden, Latet La Nachalat Goyim, with what that implies. And it's the very first relationship that we have, which is what we relive every single year in terms of the very Bikurim, which is also Rashis. Rashis is Rishul Bikurim, and we talk about that moment of K'nisa La'aretz. The development of that K'nisa La'aretz, and this the Rishonim point out in the early stages of Nevi'im Rishonim, is really a development of childhood. Because what it is that the Torah lays down in terms of the paradigm is translated actually only in Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't matter what was done as part of the development of the paradigm in the Midbar, because what we need to achieve is only the way in which the Chibur to Eretz Yisrael, which is the Chibur to Ma'aseh Bereshis in the ultimate sense, actually takes place. And therefore we have a tremendous amount of background throughout Yoshua and Shoftim until we finally get to the development of Malchus itself in Shmuel, and then we go on to an understanding of how now the relationship of Malchus to Eretz Yisrael and to the ultimate tikkun of Malchus at the end, all of those nekudas are laid down, and at that point we see how the Kilkulim lead us to Golus, which is the next stage of the original paradigm. That was the Emach HaShecha Gedela, which was expressed initially in the Bereshis Bar Elokim, V'Atzayta Tova, V'Ova, Choshech, and so on. So many of those nekudas are also, Golus itself is part of the story of Latet Nachalat Goyim, and it's part of the Nesina of Eretz Yisrael to Avram Avinu initially, and it's part of the experiences of all of the Avos, whether it's in terms only of the Plishtim or whether it's in terms of Aram and all of the dangers subsequently that affect Yaakov Avinu until the actual Yeridas Mitzrayim. But it's part of what it means to be an Av, which means it's part of what it means to be Yisrael, and therefore even that chelik is included in the elements of Nevi'im. Ketuvim, by definition, is not coming from above. In other words, the idea of Ketuvim is the translation entirely through a human mind of the experiences and vision of what has become, as particularly in the sense of the way in which the individual human responds or is used in a historical fashion, such as in Divrei Hayomi, but even in terms of the Chokhmah, and even in terms of the Hadrocha, it's extremely personal. So whether it's the personal tefillas of David HaMelech and the deep relationship that Malchus achieves at a very intimate level with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or whether it's the personal Chokhmah of the way that Shlomo HaMelech gives Hadrocha, or whether it's the personal experiences of the onset of Pekida and of the beginnings of Geula in terms of the various Megillas, or whether it's the personal, even to the extent of a virtual person, according to Muhammad Diarmar, of an understanding of the nature of Hashgacha and of the relationship of Tzaddik and Viralo and so on, which appears in Eov, or whether it's the experiences of the individual on a very, very intimate and profoundly human fashion of all of those involved in the creation of the Malchus in Ruth and so on and so forth. It is by definition a personal journey. And therefore, when we reach the end of that story, at the time of Nechemia, which is really the lowest of the low, in terms of no one really having an idea of what is going on, there being no real hadrocha milamala, there being a time of immense transition from churban to an actual functioning state, because obviously this period, even though the Gemara calls the period of Esther, of Koresh, the Pekida, but from the point of view of the clarity of where it is that we're going to be able to be a nation that is not underneath completely the thumb of the Goyim, and that actually is capable of having some element of Malchus in itself, that hasn't happened. The only thing that we have is a Beis HaMikdash, not an Am, not a Yerushalayim, and none of the things that we associate with what it means to be in a matzav of Geula. So essentially, this is a time of very deep doubt. The deep doubt comes not because we're chayshed that we won't have a Beit HaMikdash, but because we don't see an Am that can develop. And Nechemia has a plan, as we'll see. And what came before Nechemia are events of immense importance, which are clearly still in transition here, because the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah have begun their tikkun. We've already seen the tikkun of, even though we don't have the full El HaGadol, HaGibor VaNorah, but we do have at least the beginnings of that return, so that we're on our way to the Zman of the Tikkunim of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And there's already a sense that within the hiddenness of Sefer, which we've already been through with Esther, lies tremendous Giluyim which will come, but which come in a way that does not expose the Yad Hashem to an Am that is not yet ready to be able to relate to a Shechina Begalia, that is Meguleh, but in a way is more capable than ever before, which is astonishing, of relating to the undercurrents of the presence of Hashem, which is much deeper really, and which is a relationship that when it explodes into the open, is the difference between the kind of relationship that used to be between people when there was very little basis behind the relationship and the love was allowed to develop, as opposed to Bizman Hazeh, where all of the development comes early and then explodes into the fullness if one is zoche to a relationship isgalia. And these are very different ways of living, and they are a deepening, which we saw Ramazim to in Yaakov Avinu, and in the way that the relationships between his family work, and are clearly a completely new modality of how it is that we relate to our own personal Aveda, our own personal relationships, and our own personal part to play in the world. Now, what has happened is that it's because of this that we're at the very lowest point, so to speak, in terms of what Ketuvim can come to address, that we have the greatest stress on what it is that Ketuvim does. And what we have found is a sefer of Ketuvim that makes no bones about being anything more than a personal diary, which is astounding. And what we're meant to see is the way that an individual discovers his Aveda in a post-Esther period in ways that may seem very strange to us, but which are the first stages of the development. Unbelievably, it's the first stages. I mean, we think we're at the height of sophistication. The Sefer almost goes out of its way to make us recognize that we are face to face with the primitive. The primitive doesn't necessarily mean primitive in the sense that the person doesn't understand the Darkei Hashem, or that he doesn't know Torah, or anything like that. But it's primitive in simply not having had the opportunity for watching the development of how it is that the Esther of Esther ultimately will become, the way in which the entire world will develop. These hints, Gabi, please put yourself on mute. These hints are hints that have been seen earlier, and in fact, the period is still embedded in the whole story of Esther, because we're still dealing with her son. We're dealing with basically Artaxerxes here, who is the child of Esther and Achashverosh, and therefore is a full-scale Jew who is being treated here as we saw in the Gemara about the Dinim of Tzedak, and so on, is being treated as a continuation of Koresh, and his, in that name Artaxerxes, is simply part of that Malchus. So that, yes, we have no choice but to see it as primitive, the writing is primitive, the feelings are primitive and expressed in a very primitive way, and the situation is primitive and is meant to be primitive, because remember, it's the exact opposite of the original Knesset La'aretz. It's the exact opposite of the crossing of the Yarden with the Nisim and the Amida of the Oren, who is Nisav in the middle of the Yarden, and the splitting of the water, and all of that. The Gemara says what should have been Ad Yavoram Hashem, Ad Yavoram Zukanita. That in the end there were meant to be the possibility of the Nisim of the Bia Shnia, which would be the equivalent, if not greater, to the Bia Rishena. We can talk about it in terms of Lo Zochu or Goram Achet, but obviously the bottom line is that the entire period of new development is specifically a period that is meant to come mitoch Hester, and the deeper the Hester, in the end, is the deeper the Gilui. And obviously, Bizman Hazeh were profoundly, profoundly caught between those two extremes of unbelievable, miraculous activity that anyone with eyes can see, and that anyone who doesn't wish to have eyes can just walk around totally blind to. And it's the most amazing experience to be able to actually see out of one eye in one direction and out of the other eye in the other direction. So that the two aspects of what it means to be in possession of Eretz Yisrael, the Megillah and the Mustar, come together in the most amazing and sophisticated experiences, which are open to understanding only as we deepen our appreciation of the nature of Hester and Ma'aseh Bereishis and history in general, and come to a deeper understanding of the nature of Adam and the nature of consciousness and the nature of Hashgacha. All issues actually introduced in Ksuvim and coming to their fruition only at the end of the time of unbelievable Hester that Pashut caused Avram Avinu to faint dead away, and whose changes were also merumas in Sefer Daniel during that period of what will be coming, which means that it was important for us to understand the changes in the human condition and the changes, therefore, in the nature of Malchus, which are the most profound expression of social change and of change of the way in which an individual perceives himself within the world. Those changes were just as shocking to Daniel as the original vision of Ema Chashecha Gedol and Nefeles was to Avram Avinu. And just as Avram Avinu fainted dead away, Daniel found himself on the floor without the ability to pick himself up. And that means that these Ramazim are not just curiosities. What do we need to know all of the shtick of Daniel when all it's going to do is bemold all these crazy people making cheshbonos of when Mashiach is coming, which is the Gemara takes such great care to say, and the Rambam is posik with such strength. We couldn't care less about it, and nothing but destructive and a pure nonsense, and there's no reason to be Isaac in them, and there's nothing about Yiras Shamayim that can be gained from them. So then why say it, for God's sake? What do we need Ramazim for? And clearly these Ramazim are no different than the Ramazim as the Ramban understands them in the nature of Koach Ma'aseh V'Yigid Li'amo, that the whole story of Ma'aseh Bereshis is pure nonsense from the point of view of actual information and serves as nothing but a diagram, a framework, so that we can understand as our minds develop and as history develops what is happening, and all of that which is happening in the context of the Latet Lem Nachalat Goyim. This is no different. We're not meant to understand it. And as the Rambam says, even halakha in terms of the Binyan Beit HaMikdash. So when we come to hear all kinds of dinim that we can't understand in Yechezkel. So what's the point? It's exactly the same thing. There are structures that we need to understand. There's literal structures, and there are mental structures, developmental structures, historical structures, Kabbalistic structures in terms of Ma'aseh Bereshis, and so on and so forth, which it shouldn't bother us that we do not understand in detail, because they are meant to be structures particularly. And that's what they serve. The fact that we understand that we are at a primitive stage is itself important. For Daniel, the fact that he understood that he can barely grasp the changes that are going to take place, that itself was immensely important. The oversimplification that came with the belief that the end is near and that soon everything will be perfect and the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi will be Omed Al Tilai, and that we don't have, even under the best of circumstances, that we don't have a centuries and centuries long, not to mention what actually happened in terms of millennia, long distance of growth of humanity and Zelu Umadzeh, hidden within Yisrael. The shock of that, the horror of that, the people who are standing at the beginning, stands in tremendous contrast to the unbelievable joy and appreciation to those who stand at the end. And of course, at the end, everyone will stand. So we need to recognize the value of the primitive. And we need to recognize the value of the very personal vision that Nechemia presents us here. So personal, remember, that Chazal tell us that it became so intensely personal that he ended up losing the name of the Sefer, despite the fact that the Sefer is really about him. Much more than the Sefer of Esther is about Esther. The Sefer of Nechemia is about Nechemia. Because Esther indeed is an individual who's an expression of the Kitfuni Ledorot. She's an expression of specific issues of a specific person, of a specific time, that is going to be able to create a change from Gilui into Esther, into Hester, and that itself will end up becoming that is a historical function where she finds herself at a moment of malchut, which in the end, of course, turns out to be precisely that. But Daniel does not have any of that, although he wishes to. Instead, what Daniel is a visionary from a completely human point of view. The only thing that was given to him was a position that allowed him to think, to act upon his thinking. That's all. Being the drinking partner of the king was not miraculous. It was not an insane story of, oh my God, how did you get to this position? I mean, for heaven's sakes, compare the fact that the grandchild of Shaul HaMelech, who was the one that provided for the presence of Haman. I mean, that's crazy. That old story to say, Mi yodeim la'it kazoti. I mean, of course. You got to be nuts not to see that. For Daniel, on the other hand, to be coming around and saying, oh my gosh, the Yad Elohai Tov Alai. You have no idea of all the amazing visions that the Lord put into my heart. Well, it's all very nice, but it's not persuasive necessarily to anybody else. So I understand. I mean, that's what he says, you know. The Yad Elohai Tovai Elai, and nobody knew, you know, what my plans were, because these were the plans that God put into my heart. You know, okay, so say you. But again, this is a completely self-motivated thing which fits directly into the very end of Ketuvim. And written as it is, in a time of such transition, from Churban to the beginnings of a functional state, from the Ha'el HaGadol to the beginnings of the Achei Knesset HaGadol, from the Migdash to Yerushalayim, means that those issues are all interrelated. And that indeed he is smart enough, brilliant enough actually, to recognize that in his personal story, and it's so personal, that even the information that he has that triggers and catalyzes his response is also a personal message from my good brother, Hanani. I mean, what a crazy way to start a story, you know. So again, you know, meet up with Hanani, Echad Me'achai, you know, man, oh man, and he's giving me these things, and all of a sudden he sees these things are just two central issues, which to him are interrelated, and obviously Hanani was pretty brilliant himself to be able to define these two issues. The two issues are the Am and the Ir. And nobody's talked about those issues before. The focus was entirely on Beis Hamikdash, and that's what Ezra got permission to do, and that's what Ezra came to do. And in fact, Ezra had to scrupulously avoid all other issues, and any hint that there might be other issues actually led to a cessation of the building of the Beis Hamikdash itself because of the Kisvei Sitna. This is, in fact, an amazing development in which he, in his own mind, links those two things, and he recognizes that actually the condition of Yerushalayim and the belief of the Am in itself as the Medina, which is what Yerushalayim was called, the outside of the Beis Hamikdash, the extension into what needed to be an expression of what was in the Midbar. The paradigm in the Midbar was the Machane Yisrael. That the Machane Yisrael does not exist. And what's even more amazing is his understanding that the Machane Yisrael needed to be a mechitza. It needed to be an actual place that was defined by, as Chazal called it, a mechitza. If the bosser is yaitzer chutz mechitza, then the bosser is nifsa. If the mechitza is broken, it's the same thing as picking up the machana and moving it around in the midbar, and everything becomes nifsa, and I start over again. he recognizes that it is impossible to create an Am that is capable of all of the things that an Am must do in terms of memshala even, alachas kama v'kama, real malchus, and the development of all the things that come later in such shocking ways. We don't know how those happen because Ksuvim ends before they happen. All we know is that out of these primitive beginnings, we ended up with a country that went on for hundreds and hundreds of years and that faced all types of challenges and met those challenges. And we're coming up to Hanukkah now with some of the most shocking expressions of those challenges. How did all this happen from a couple of broken down buildings and one Beis HaMikdash that was barely functional? It's an amazing story. So that means if this is what the Torah gives us, these are the roots of that story. And only one person figured out what needed to be done. And that was the restoration of the Mechitza that would enable there to be the Kedusha of Yerushalayim, within which Klal Yisrael would be able to recreate what Machane Yisrael did in the Midbar, and out of that would come an Am and a Medina and a belief. He connected this to the psychological condition in which it was possible for the biggest idiots and fools who actually talk between themselves as if they are nothing but simple beryonim today, who have no real awareness of anything. They're just the kind of people that you meet, walking through the shuk. And they were somehow capable of keeping the Am in a position of self-doubt and feeling mevuzim, and everybody feels like it's worthless. How is that possible? Where is it that we can allow that kind of bizui, which is much more personal there than the amazing attempt by exactly the same type of buffoons in the United Nations, evil clowns that can barely speak, or of course the more sophisticated leitzanim in the United Nations. It's much more personal, that on a personal level was able to keep people feeling that they are useless and their lives are meaningless, and therefore there can be no response. Exactly what happened in Mitzrayim, where everybody had given up, where the Gedolei Hador had given up, where nothing is happening, nothing is changing, nobody can do anything. There's Amram, what's he doing? Here, basically, one little guy takes the place of the vision that Miriam had essentially given then as a child, and he's very primitive, childlike himself, and he has an understanding that there needs to be something that will restore the sense of mitzvah and avodah. And we know that that's what he was thinking, because he goes out of his way to tell us of his tefillah. And that's what his tefillah is about. And he says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, now look, you promised us that I'm going to bring you back. That's what you said. And that through that bringing back, we're going to be able. That's what you said. Now I'm telling you that and the only thing that's going to make them realize that is the fact that you bring them and that is not happening because that's not the Mokum. The Mokum isn't the Beis HaMikdash. The Mokum is the Mechitza that contains that Beis HaMikdash, and the Chatzor is Beis Hashem, which are the Aveda that they are capable of being involved in. And therefore, I'm telling you that this is what they want, and they need to be given the opportunity, and I'm begging you, give them the opportunity. So see how profound his understanding is of the role that Yerushalayim has to play on every level, on the completely theoretical level of the provision of a Mechitza for Machane Yisrael, on the much more emotional level of restoring the people's belief that they are something that they can do. something simple that they can do. They can pick up a shovel and then they'll pick up a gun in their other hand. And they can do something about the situation. And then, more profoundly, in the actual presence of a place and an achievement, they can restore their sense of dignity, in which the foolishness of the buffoons like Sanballat is capable of being laughed off, which is exactly what he sets out to do. Laugh them away and let everyone see the ugliness of what these people are. And therefore, he is caught, as we said, in a very difficult situation because he has to take himself very, very seriously if he's to achieve any of this, which means that he has to be very, very careful that nobody feels that he's taking himself seriously. And he fails in that HaKadosh Baruch Hu thinks he's taking himself seriously. And he lets it slip that he's taking himself seriously, even by asking for the Zochrenina, which is part of the ultimate Zikaron, in actually to be a Sefer in Tanakh, which he feels is coming to him because of his Asik and the Zecher of Yad Vashem and Chomot Yerushalayim, and in the Sefer Asher Ani Kotev, which is the Sefer of Yerushalayim. So because of that, he indeed fails on some level because of that tremendous challenge. So he is constantly challenged in another way that Esther doesn't have to worry as much about, and that is in making sure that the others are participating. Esther is deeply concerned by this problem, but she doesn't have to do very much about it because the circumstances put everyone on notice that it's do or die. And therefore, all she needs to do is give them the message. You know, you've all got to get together. There's something to be done. You have to be mispalo. You have to be tzomo alai. And you have to be ready to protect yourselves and get weapons ready. I mean, so there was a focus. And there was the ability to address everyone as if there was an internet. There were 127, did you know it, with 127 languages, with Federal Express dashing out at every time there was a message to be given. He doesn't have any of those powers at all. Instead, he's faced with absolute boredom, with a loss of all belief, with a sense that not only is there nothing to be done, there's not all that much need to do it. It's so completely out of anybody's thought processes that we need to do something about it. And therefore, he is in a position where for many, many reasons, he needs to be tsanua about what he is doing. And what he's done is he's created, again, I mean, the man's brilliance comes through in ways that he's careful not to openly say. He's created a multi-tiered system of secrecy in which everyone thinks they know what's going on, but nobody knows what's going on. So the Melech thinks he knows what's going on because it's all been described as the need to provide for the poor, miserable Jews and the breaking down of all of their past history. People need graves to pray at, and they need a connection to their own pasts. Fine, great. I understand that, and it's part of the needs of the Malchus. As far as what he managed to give over to others that this is all about, by engaging in all of his very open letters and passing between different countries and making a big shtick about everybody needs to be involved and passing him through and so on. Well, what happens over there is he creates a strong sense that there's interest in establishing a mission to the Jews from the Malchus, and therefore he builds his embassy and he does all of those things and he makes all of this fuss while nobody has a clue that he has any plans whatsoever about the restoration of mechitzos. As far as they're concerned, he's going to be going to Har HaZeisim to fix up the kfaras, you know. And yeah, he might fix up the sha'arim that he spoke about, because, I mean, that's only decent. But, I mean, what's this business about mechitzas? I mean, who needs mechitzas? And so on. That was never discussed. So he wants to build up the city. That's what he says, but it's his genius to realize that the city is not just any old city. This is a city that requires mechitzas first and building later, and that has to be explained to people. And then the people that are with him, even, as we see in the Psukim, he doesn't tell them his idea of what God, so to speak, implanted in him about the change in Yerushalayim. All that he does is tell them that, we need to take care of our city until he is ready to act and actually has achieved the first stages. And that the Kurz of Machlokas Rishonim how to understand the word ad kain, what that kain is. It's what particular point he has to reach before he's ready to actually tell them his real plan. But during this period, he understands that he's got to make people believe that they can make a difference. He's got to make not only the king think one thing, his enemies think another thing, his own countrymen think yet a third thing, but even the ones that are working with him to focus on something else. And during this entire period, he needs to protect his mission from all bizayon, from all li'iga, and the very fact that, remarkably, he doesn't even explain in the Sefer the strange things that he's doing. He doesn't say why he's walking around Yerushalayim, if we read the words to be shover, the choma. He doesn't say what my purpose is in that. And even those who hold that shover is just a hachlafa of sover, obviously there's a reason that he's saying that he's shover is the way to say that he's sover, which is that I'm analyzing the strength of the wall and so on and so forth. Things are happening behind the scenes where his own recognition of the unavoidability and therefore the complete value of the works of an individual in very small ways become the way in which Geula takes place, which is, take a look back at Mitzrayim, and it's exactly what happened there. It was the most ridiculously small, to the point where the Torah makes almost a joke of it. We're talking about Shifra Vapua because of the Lashonas. I mean, it's crazy. These are like the least important things. But in terms of that original Geula, they were everything. And so too in terms of the original Bias Haaretz here, which is done instead of with the Shekhinah, the Golui, with everything hidden, it's the very fact that each and every person was given a sense of the importance of these silly little things that they're doing that was as important to this seeding of the Geula Shniya as those events in Mitzrayim were for the Geula Rishona. And what's remarkable is that really is the Beveitiu V'chomotai, and that really does provide for his ability to be lo'eg on those who were lo'eg to us and show them that the important issue is Yerushalayim. And the important issue is that only avadav of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's the v'yashivo tam davar, v'yomar lohem Elohei HaShamayim u'yatzliach lanu. Why is it Elohei HaShamayim and not Elohei HaAretz? Because that's the whole point. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not being expressed as Elohei HaAretz here. And nonetheless, he is saying, Anachnu avadav, nakumu vaninu. It's the Aveda that's important. And as Avadim, we can build, and it will work. But to those who are not Avadim and have their own agenda, it can't work. And that reflects directly back on his original tefillah, in which he made it clear that it's the desire to be your avodim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is the basis of my tefillah to you. And therefore he has no choice, and this is a tremendous limud for us, he has no choice but to believe that without any kind of nevias, and without any kind of messages, and without any kind of specific, immense historical coincidence, that he had a right to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Tovailai, the Yad Elokai was Tovailai, and the fact that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me in Rashi's Lashon Chen v'Hatzlacha Lifnei HaMelech, and that it was all meant Litova, again as Rashi says. All of this was the kavanah for that Tova of the building of the Chomat HaIr. That was the Tova. And the fact that his own idea was given to him directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu because it made sense so totally within this, what it was that this man was mechayev him to do, and that the only way that he would be able to present it to them was within such a context. This is, in and of itself, before we learn anything else, a tremendous, tremendous limud. It's a revelation about our own situation and about the extent at which we are mechuyev to respond to the Yad Eloheinu, Asher Tova Aleinu, and to the visions that we have of what it's possible to achieve out of our own learning and our own understanding, and out of recognizing when Azman is Geula, that steps must be taken in the smallest ways to achieve that Geula. This itself is an unbelievable limud before we even get to all of the details that we need to have in order to fill out that framework and that structure. So I think that this is at least a good introduction, utilizing all of your insights and all of your ha'ores. And of course, I mean, I want to handle one parak at a time. You guys are so fast, you're going to finish the entire sefer before we finish the second parak. But I think this serves as a wonderful, wonderful introduction to the sefer as a whole. And it's an introduction that we only could understand after reading these first prakim. So with that, I'll leave you with that on, we could review it on YouTube for those who weren't able to be there the whole time. And I thank you so much once again, not only for participating now, but for all the great work that was done in advance. Please, please try to get more people to be willing to write and to open themselves to others about these ideas. I'm sure that there's much to be thought about, because obviously they're dangerous ideas as well as they were to Nechemia himself. And the misuse of these ideas that we see all around us, and we've been watching for decades and decades, in which people make the mistake of believing that it's the Yad Eloheinu, Tova Aleinu, and are disappointed by the results in horrible ways that have to do with Yerush Haaretz themselves. And these are things that make us rethink, by recognizing the sakonas, rethink, the type of things that we come up with. So please take that into consideration as well in your responses, so that we don't end up, with a Gush Katif kind of situation. So, okay, everyone. It's wonderful, wonderful seeing you. I can't even begin. I'm so overwhelmed every time you get on. It's mamish amazing. It's this sense of being, all over the world at one time. There's like this aura hatera, and the lave that Nechemia speaks about, the leva is just an amazing feeling. And I'm really very, very grateful. I'm so sorry that some people weren't able to get onto the Hangout. I don't understand it. But at least you're on YouTube, so that's Rav Hashem. Okay, everybody, Laila Tov. It's been wonderful. Love you all.